Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie, and today we'll be talking about what to do when your fermentation stops midway. So I just want to say that this is the first time this happens. Usually the fermentation runs smoothly or it does not start at all. So this is a normal pit point in your home brewer's journey when your fermentation starts, but it doesn't continue. And first of all, how do I know that this happened? How do I know that it started, and how do I know that it stopped and it just stayed there? So first of all, I made two batches roughly 1 day apart. So their fermentation should last around the same amount of time, which is 3 to 4 weeks. And they should be at the same gravity, which is 1.000 or 0.990, roughly at the same time, give or take 1 or 2 days difference, because they're also being fermented in the same temperature. So same degrees Celsius, I'm using the same yeast. And just FYI, one of the main factors for your fermentation duration is the temperature. So if you're in a warmer climate, or if you leave your fermentation happen in a warmer climate, the fermentation has more chances of finishing quicker because the yeast is active. However, if you're in a cold environment, or if your fermentation is put in a dark, dingy area of your kitchen or of a room, your yeast slows down because it's sleeping and it eats sugar at a slower rate. Therefore, your alcohol production will be slower as well. So these two batches, one was made from grape juice and the other one was made with water and sugar. And the starting gravity for both were almost the same. One was at 1.115 starting gravity, and the other one was at 1.094 starting gravity. So the higher your starting gravity is, the longer it's going to take for your alcohol to be produced. However, it's all in the range of 3 to 4 weeks. So I did one batch, and then the day after I started another batch, and the one that was started the following day is done. So the final gravity is at 1.000, and I tasted the other batch, the one that was made before, just to see what's happening with it, and it seemed a little sweet. A little sweeter than usual. It tasted good. However, if it's too sweet, there's an indication that your sugar is still present and that the yeast didn't eat all the sugar that's available to make all the alcohol. So we're gonna make a test today, and I have a cylinder, and I had already put the liquid inside the cylinder. It's here, and you just have to drop in the hydrometer and see what is the current gravity of the alcohol. And as you see, the hydrometer is pretty high up. So if it were done, it would be roughly here at 1.000 or 0.990 final gravity. However, it's all the way up there. And I'm not the one pushing it up. That's really just the amount of sugar that's present. The hydrometer measures your amount of sugar inside your alcohol, and this is way too high for it to be done. How do I know that it started? Because the initial gravity was at 1.115, and now it's at 0.062 or 64 roughly. So a little fermentation happened, meaning a little bit of sugar was eaten by the yeast. However, it just stopped there. And the reasons for this is the batch where it was too hot, and we poured the yeast when it was too hot. Therefore, a few yeast cells died because it didn't handle the temperature, and the dead yeast were eaten by the alive yeast. However, I usually use half a pack of EC1118, and since some of it died, less yeast was available to eat the sugar. Therefore, what I'm going to do with this batch is to add more yeast in. However, just be careful that the more yeast you add to your batch, the taste can change. And you don't want to add too much yeast because you don't want it to taste yeasty. Therefore, I will add a bit of yeast, but not too much, and I will have to wait a little bit longer than expected for the fermentation to be over. However, the good part of adding more yeast is that you'll have more alcohol at the end, and the sweetness will dissipate a bit. So the sweetness will be transformed into alcohol. Therefore, I will add a little bit of the same yeast that I added. Let me know in the comments below if you've added different strains of yeast in one type of alcohol. What yeast prevails? I have yet to add different yeast strains in one same batch. And if you'd like more tips and tricks on the quantities, on the yeast to use, book a class below. The link is in the description. Another thing that I can do to invigorate the yeast is to stir the jar, and by doing that, I will awaken the yeast a bit. However, I've already shook this jar and I put it in a really warm temperature, and that has not worked. The fermentation has still stopped. Therefore, this is really my last point in trying to invigorate the yeast, or in trying to restart the fermentation, is by adding a little bit more yeast into the jar. And I will give you an update on if it changed the final taste of the alcohol, because honestly right now I could drink it. However, the alcohol is not very strong because not much sugar has been eaten by the yeast, and it's very juicy. It's a little creamy from what I've been hearing. So we want to make it more, give it a bit more of a stronger wine taste. One thing I really like about this batch is the color. So if you see it here, the color is nice and you can see the hydrometer across. Therefore, the alcohol is already getting transparent and the yeast is setting towards the bottom. So what we want to do by adding a bit more yeast is to just shake up the whole jar again, invigorate it, and it's going to have to start the process from the beginning. And once you add more yeast, by looking at the back of the package, I see that the optimal temperature for this yeast is 30 to 35 degrees Celsius. So it would be best once the yeast is added to add it into a warm room. And just an FYI that this optimal temperature at the back of the package is only for the first 1 to 3 days of your fermentation. It doesn't have to be at that high temperature for the whole 3 weeks of your fermentation. So that's one option, to put your whole jar in a room, or you can make a yeast starter, put a little bit of the liquid from your batch, put it inside a little dish, warm it up to the optimal temperature, and then add the yeast in there and start your yeast starter. And once the yeast has already been active, then drop it in the fermenting jar for it to continue its sugar eating journey. And the goal of doing all this is for your hydrometer to read 0.990 to 1.000 as a final gravity, because that's the only way that we'll know for sure if your fermentation is done. In case you need a little demonstration of how to do a yeast starter, so I have the EC1118 here. I have my yeast starter over here. And the yeast starter that I used was this batch here that was stuck. So I used the same liquid and I put it inside a little dish that's glass. I put it in the microwave, heated up for roughly 50 seconds, just so the optimal temperature is good for the yeast. And the optimal temperature for the yeast is 35 to 37 degrees Celsius. So once you open the package, I had already put yeast inside this jar, therefore I will not be adding half the package. I'm just gonna add a bit just to make sure that the fermentation starts again. You see that there? Ooh, the yeast smells, and now I'm just gonna shake it up a bit. So you see that the yeast is already starting to be hydrated. And now I'm just gonna wait 30 minutes up to 2 hours or 2 days if I'm really patient, and I'm gonna dump it in here to get the fermentation back up. And just a reminder, the final goal is to have the final gravity at 0.990 to 1.000, and that way we'll know that your alcohol is done. I've waited 1 hour for this yeast to just submerge into the alcohol, and it's calmed down a bit. And the next step with this yeast starter is to put it in the alcohol jar. So once that's in, I'm just gonna put it back in a warm environment and let the fermentation continue. Once it's in, we're gonna shake it up a bit, make sure that the yeast reaches different areas of your alcohol. And you see the airlock, and the goal is for the airlock to keep bubbling again until the fermentation is over. And if you found this video valuable, share it with a friend. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.